There are two kinds of silence in this world. The first is the silence of avoidance. The hush that hides what we fear will surface if we speak. The second is the silence of depth. The stillness that listens, that receives, that waits for truth to reveal itself without being forced. Kahlil Gibran lived in the second silence. His words didn't come from a need to explain life, but from an ache to feel it more honestly. The quiet ones, like him, are not detached from the world. They are absorbing it, slowly, almost painfully, because every sound, gesture, and pause carries meaning to them that most people rush past. The observing mind is not cold. It is overwhelmed by aliveness. When you have learned to see beneath words, you stop reacting to noise and start perceiving essence. Gibran once wrote, "The silence of the night is the whisper of eternity." He understood that stillness is not emptiness. It's the space where the soul begins to listen. Many people fear silence because it mirrors them. But the quiet mind doesn't flee from mirrors. It studies them. It asks, what am I still pretending not to know? Those who live deeply often appear detached because they experience layers at once. While others speak, they are hearing the emotion behind the tone, the history inside the posture, the unspoken longing hiding between breaths. Observation is empathy turned inward and outward simultaneously. It requires the surrender of performance. The quiet observer does not need to be interesting. They long to be real. This is why people sometimes misinterpret depth as distance. When someone listens without interrupting, the insecure ego senses judgment. But in truth, the quiet listener is not judging. They are witnessing. They are creating an emotional mirror where others can see themselves clearly, maybe for the first time. Gibran's psychology rests in this paradox. To love life deeply, one must first learn to observe it without clinging. There's a moment in everyone's life when they realize the cost of speaking too soon. We interrupt our own wisdom when we rush to fill silence. We think meaning will vanish if we don't capture it quickly. But meaning ripens in stillness. That's why deep minds appear slow to respond. They're not lagging, they're digesting. They know that the truth of a moment reveals itself after emotion settles. The calmness others find intimidating is, for them, simply accuracy. The observing mind doesn't take things at face value. It watches how people edit themselves in real time, how the eyes flicker when a truth almost escapes, how laughter rises to mask discomfort. If you've ever felt like you could see through people, you may know this sensitivity. It is both a gift and a burden. Gibran's sensitivity was not intellectual. It was soulful. He perceived that behind every defense lies tenderness, and behind every opinion, a wound. To see this way is to live in constant empathy. It explains why Gibran's words feel both universal and deeply personal. He spoke not to impress, but to relieve the quiet ache that lives in everyone. The ache of wanting to be seen without having to perform. The psychology of his stillness rests on this. The quieter you become, the more others reveal themselves. But what makes someone become this way? Often, quiet observation begins as protection. In childhood, those who couldn't control chaos learned to read the room for safety. They noticed tone before words, energy before movement. Observation became survival. Later, it became identity. So the adult who sees deeply is often the child who once had to. Their quietness isn't shyness, it's wisdom that was born too early. This is why many deep thinkers carry a soft sadness, even when they smile. They have seen too much without being seen themselves. Observation is powerful, but it can be lonely. When you perceive life in layers, surface-level connection rarely satisfies. Others talk about events. You feel the undercurrents. You notice when joy feels forced, when kindness hides exhaustion. And you can't unsee it. Yet Gibran didn't drown in what he saw. He transformed it into beauty. That's what the deep, quiet mind does. It alchemizes perception into poetry. It doesn't escape reality. It refines it into language the heart can hold. This is emotional intelligence at its highest form, turning awareness into compassion instead of judgment. Still, the observing mind has a limit. There's a danger in always watching, never participating. At some point, awareness becomes armor. You start analyzing your feelings instead of feeling them. You confuse understanding with healing. Gibran wrote, "Half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it so that the other half may reach you." He knew that expression, even imperfect, is necessary for intimacy. The mind that only observes eventually starves for reciprocity. If this feels familiar, stay with me. Because there's something tender here, the realization that quietness is not just a trait, it's a threshold, a doorway between solitude and connection. The same sensitivity that isolates you is also what will let you love without illusion. The same stillness that made you invisible will one day make you unforgettable. But only if you let yourself be seen by what you once only observed. Gibran's psychology is a bridge between emotion and art, between pain and perception. He shows us that quiet observation isn't withdrawal. It's preparation. The observer gathers fragments of human truth, not to analyze, but to understand how all of it fits inside the soul. The question is, what happens when the observer finally steps into the scene they've been watching all their life? When the observer begins to participate, something shifts in the inner landscape. The silence that once protected begins to open. The same stillness that guarded now invites. For Gibran, observation was never meant to be a wall. It was meant to be a window. The difference is vulnerability. To look through a window is to remain safe. To open it is to let the wind touch you. The psychology of depth is not in seeing. It's in letting yourself be moved by what you see. Quiet people often believe that wisdom lies in detachment. But real wisdom lies in contact. The quiet observer eventually realizes that understanding people isn't enough. You have to let them matter. You can know every reason behind someone's pain and still not love them. Empathy without involvement becomes sterile. It's easier to analyze emotion than to risk feeling it. But as Gibran wrote, if you love and must needs have desires, let these be your desires, to melt and be like a running brook that sings its melody to the night. True understanding sings when you let it flow through you. Many deep minds spend years learning to control emotion, not realizing that control is the opposite of intimacy. When you study others for too long, you start doing the same with yourself. You observe your sadness instead of comforting it. You critique your vulnerability instead of expressing it. Gibran's work reminds us that self-awareness must eventually soften into self-acceptance. The observing mind heals only when it stops performing insight and starts practicing tenderness. Stillness becomes stagnant when it forgets to breathe. The observer must occasionally close their eyes, not to block the world out, but to trust that not everything needs to be watched to be real. Control and observation share the same root: fear. The fear of chaos, misunderstanding, rejection. But Gibran's deep quiet was not fear-based. It was faith-based. He trusted that truth reveals itself in silence, that love doesn't need to be dissected to be understood. This is the subtle difference between repression and reverence. Repression silences feeling. Reverence listens to it. The quiet, observing mind must ask itself, am I silent because I'm afraid to feel, or because I'm ready to? Gibran's stillness was alive, not numb. His quietness did not hide him. It revealed him in the most human way possible, by showing restraint in a world addicted to reaction. To observe deeply is to suffer the ache of beauty. You notice how everything passes: joy, sorrow, connection, even clarity. The quiet mind lives close to impermanence. That's why it rarely takes things for granted. Gibran found comfort in this transient view of life. He saw that the brevity of moments is what makes them precious. When you live this way, gratitude replaces attachment. You don't hold on, you honor. But living with such perception is exhausting. The world's noise doesn't fade, it grows louder. The more you see, the less you can ignore. Every lie feels heavy. Every truth feels raw. So the deep mind oscillates between immersion and withdrawal. It steps into life, feels too much, then retreats to regain balance. Observation becomes a rhythm of breathing. Inhale the world, exhale understanding. That rhythm is both a gift and a responsibility. The quiet observer must learn discernment, what to internalize, what to release. Without boundaries, empathy becomes erosion. Gibran's own life was marked by solitude, not as avoidance, but as maintenance. Depth requires space. The quiet mind regenerates in aloneness, so that when it returns, it can perceive freshly again. Yet the paradox remains. Every observer longs to be seen. Behind every silent listener is an unspoken wish that someone might finally observe them with the same care, that someone might understand that silence is not absence. It's the language of depth. Gibran gave his silence words so that others might recognize theirs. But recognition alone isn't enough. The next question is, can the observer allow their own story to be witnessed? Can the one who always listens finally speak, not to explain, but to exist? The deep mind fears exposure because it equates visibility with misunderstanding. But perhaps to be seen imperfectly is still better than to remain unseen entirely. There is a moment, subtle and sacred, when the quiet observer realizes that the world is not asking for their insight, it's asking for their presence. And presence requires surrender. The mind must step aside so that the heart can breathe. That is the threshold Gibran crossed in his art. His words are not observation anymore. They are participation. They don't describe life from afar. They become life itself. Still, What happens when the mind that once saw everything begins to see itself? The quiet observer eventually turns inward, not as retreat, but as revelation. Gibran's final gift to us was the reminder that observation of the world is only half the journey. The rest is witnessing oneself with the same compassion one offers others. The psychology of depth becomes self-psychology. The mind that once studied humanity begins to study the tender mechanisms of its own longing. To see yourself clearly is the hardest kind of seeing, because once you do, excuses dissolve. You notice the subtle ways you self-abandon, the smiles that conceal unease, the small silences that keep the peace but cost you presence. The deep mind that observes itself begins to understand that wisdom without embodiment is another form of escape. You can know every pattern of human pain and still be living inside your own. Gibran's reflections often read like letters to his own soul. Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding, he wrote. To him, self-awareness was not an achievement. It was a dismantling. The quiet observer learns that pain itself is a form of perception. It shows where love is trying to return. When we stop running from our discomfort, it stops chasing us. The deep mind finally rests when it allows imperfection to coexist with insight. Many who live in quiet observation mistake neutrality for peace. They suppress emotion to maintain clarity, forgetting that clarity is born from honest feeling. True balance is not control, it's acceptance. To be serene is not to feel less, but to trust that feeling will not destroy you. Gibran's psychology whispers this truth gently. You cannot perceive the beauty of life from a safe distance. You must step into its storm and trust the stillness within you to hold steady. The deep, quiet, observing mind is both sanctuary and labyrinth. It holds wisdom, but also echo. Every insight you find echoes back, asking, will you live what you see? The mind that once interpreted others must now interpret its own defenses. The urge to analyze instead of surrender, to stay detached instead of vulnerable. That's the secret struggle of the introspective. The more you understand, the harder it becomes to simply be. Gibran invites the observer to unlearn sophistication, to let perception become participation again, to speak not from mastery, but from wonder. Because the more you know of humanity, the more tender you must become. Knowledge without softness becomes judgment, but when knowledge meets compassion, observation becomes art. There's something profoundly human about his psychology. It doesn't aim to fix the contradictions. It honors them. The observer and the participant, the silence and the voice, the intellect and the soul. They are all parts of one rhythm. The deep mind doesn't need to choose between them. It needs to learn to dance with both. When the quiet mind stops fearing noise, it discovers music. When it stops fearing emotion, it discovers truth. And when it stops fearing visibility, it discovers love. The same sensitivity that once guarded becomes the bridge that connects. This is the alchemy of depth, turning awareness into intimacy, solitude into empathy. Still, the journey never truly ends, because the more you see, the more mystery reveals itself. The observing mind does not conquer truth. It befriends it. It learns that wisdom is not certainty. It's humility. Every insight is temporary, every understanding a doorway to another question. Gibran's voice reminds us that depth is not a destination, but a way of being, gentle, curious, endlessly awake. Perhaps this is the quiet revolution of the deep mind, to stay open even after knowing so much, to listen again even after hearing everything, to love even after seeing the flaws. The observer's greatest transformation is not in seeing more, but in seeing with kindness. And maybe that's where Gibran still lives, not in the words we quote, but in the spaces between them, in the pauses we finally allow, in the moments we stop explaining and simply notice. The deep, quiet, observing mind continues its gaze, not to define, but to feel, not to conclude, but to remain, beautifully, courageously awake.